in Alan's session today, just to lead with a few questions. I was lucky enough to actually have Alan presented in one of our company events. I think it was February, the end of January.
It was at the end of ICE, yeah.
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago around ICE, and it was so insightful that I'm actually quite excited about, the next 30, 40 minutes, and I'm sure all of you guys in the room would love the next session and get a lot from it. And we'll try to leave some time for questions at the end, so we'll see how it goes. But I'll start with an opening question, Alan, if that's okay. You described the industry as entering Act 3. What does it mean?
Yeah, so I'll just kind of briefly introduce myself for those who don't know me. My name's Alun Bowden. I work at Eilers Krejcik Gaming. I've been in this industry for 24 and a bit years now, which is terrifying. Started as the founder editor of VGR. I don't know if any of you know that title, back in 2002. I've been working with Eilers Krejcik, which is a kind of research and advisory consultancy. We're based in Southern California, but we cover pretty much all over the world. Been working with them since about 2015. It's very kind words spoken about me. I would say if you want to gauge my sharpness, I twice tried to wash my hands with mouthwash in the toilet just now. So that's the kind of level we're dealing with here. Also, I noticed you're not supposed to swear, so that's going to be possibly my biggest strategic challenge of the entire day. Yeah. But I will do my best not to do so. But yeah, so Act 3. So when I started in the industry, can we get this going? There we go. When I started in the industry in 2002, there was really only one model that existed. It was do what you like. It was the do what you will era, which I guess we're coming back to now, and we'll get to in a sec. There was technically licenses, there were licensed entities. That was mostly just to allow you access to payments frameworks, but largely it was just a big mass of gray. The US was open. You could kind of offer your services any way you liked to anyone you wanted at any time, pretty much. And then we started to enter into the second era, which was the kind of era of when regulation started to happen, when the industry started to grow up a little bit, when we started to get access to things like PPC, and PPC didn't even really exist when we first started it, but we started to mature a little bit, enter into sort of regulated states. And then what happened was really interesting, because we had this kind of duality that existed across the industry, where we had increasingly regulated operators sitting comfortably alongside grey market operators, so the earlier model, and largely, often the biggest companies were both of those entities. If you think of your Entains or your PokerStars or many of the companies that existed then, they were grey market operators that also had regulated businesses, and everyone was fine with that. That kind of sat happily alongside each other. Now we're entering kind of what I would call Act 3, online gambling 3.0, however you want to deem it. And that's really where that grey market has kind of shriveled up and is basically dead. There are not really any legitimate grey markets left in the world now. New Zealand is regulating, Canada is regulating, India has just kicked everybody out. There's not a lot left that you can viably, realistically say is a legitimate grey market where there's an absence of regulation and what you're doing is completely reasonable and sensible. You've really got white markets and black markets. And that's what exists in the current day. And you kind of have to choose. You kind of have to choose where you sit within that ecosystem. And then even within those kind of white market ecosystems, you have to decide, am I a European operator? Am I a North American operator? Am I an African operator? You kind of can't be all of those things. Even within Europe, you kind of, UKI success doesn't really translate to Italy. Italy success doesn't really translate to the Netherlands, et cetera, et cetera. You can go on and on. So there is kind of we started off with one big global market that we could all access, and then it was all about execution, as we've heard today already. Then we entered into this kind of fractured world where you could get the benefits of regulation, but still get the nice cash generation of grey markets, and now that's ended. And we have a very different, very fragmented world. And oh, is it crackling on my? Okay, sorry. Oh, wow. That's very different. Okay, so and now we're in, and that regulatory change, that shift to regulations, is kind of changing the perception of what
kind of value means and changing the perception of what operators can expect to make from those markets. And it really is kind of defining the new era. You know, you have really compressed EBITDA margins, and you have kind of really fundamentally changed player values in the regulated market. And you've also got the kind of the death of easy growth. So I hesitate to use the word easy. It was never easy, but it was certainly easier to kind of, you know, just build a big funnel and scale up, cast a big net, catch some whales. The various models that kind of sustained the industry for really 20 years, most of those have kind of gone away now, and they don't really exist. And what we also find is the industry is at different points of the curve in different places. And that's kind of always been the case to an extent, but largely what worked in one market would pretty much work in another. Well, now that's just so radically different. You know, you have markets such as, you know, some of the African markets that are opening up are so fundamentally different to some of the maturing European markets. Then you have some of the kind of nascent European markets, which are very fundamentally different to some of the LATAM markets, which are very fundamentally different. And you get the point, right? Everything is very, very different now. And you have this kind of fractured global picture. Overlaid on top of that, there's really complex and difficult regulation. Overlaid on top of that, you kind of have compressed declining value in various pictures. It's very, very hard to be a regulated operator in the industry right now. And you have to recognize the change.
Can I ask you a question about that, just because it's something we kind of deal with all the time. We see all of those things happening, but at the same time, and I'm sure most of you guys probably been to Barcelona a few weeks ago and experienced the scale of, I think there was 75,000 people attending ICE this year in Barcelona. So while things are definitely, there's more scrutiny and more taxes and regulation, and things are more difficult, at the same time, we feel like the number of players in the market is growing and keeps growing, right? So how do you feel those two kind of powers are working together? They, in a way, they contradict each other, but maybe they don't, I don't know.
No, they don't. They are entirely part of the same picture. So what the regulated industry has left behind, the black market, crypto industry, dark gray, you can call it gray if you like, but it doesn't really matter. They're just terms. It's an operating model rather than a kind of a legal definition. That's picked up the slack. You know, you've seen huge growth from not just operators, but suppliers. You know, suppliers who are kind of nowhere in the industry, and I'm not going to name names because I don't want to do that, but, you know, are now massive power players within the supplier sector, solely off the back of kind of black market and crypto. You know, you look at some of these new launches, some of them stagger me. You see, you know, VC funding in the US for crypto casinos that target black market Germany and Australia, and everyone seems fine with this. It's absolutely bizarre. But this is the industry we're in now, and this is kind of the reality that people need to recognize and appreciate, is that you have a white market, which is tough, hard, expensive, difficult, declining values, compressed margins, and then you have a black market, which is largely like Act One, and is just kind of reshaping everything. It's putting huge competitive pressure on everyone else. There we go, as we lead on to it, you know, it's putting huge pressure on everyone else, but it's also creating kind of really interesting competitive dynamics as well, because, you know, those markets are innovating. They are doing kind of cool stuff. They're doing interesting stuff. They are capturing the attention of a younger audience as well. You know, you've seen the kind of the rise of originals games, which is an absurd name for a series of copies of games. But, you know, those games have now becoming, you know, increasingly an expectation of a certain type of player, and they're starting bleeding their way into the kind of regulated market as well. You're kind of seeing, you know, the kind of no KYC onboarding experience, you know, the friction that players hit when they hit regulated sites versus black market sites is so different now in most markets, not in all. But, you know, it's kind of really changing. It's really changing the rules, and the way they market is also really different. You know, people think might want to kind of rewrite history backwards and say that, Stake was incredibly clever launching its own streaming platform. It just got kicked off Twitch and had to do something else. So, would it have done that if it hadn't have been kicked off Twitch? I'm not entirely sure. But, they've had to, like the original industry back in the early 2000s, they've had to find ways around stuff, so influencer marketing, marketing via Telegram and Discord, launching on their own streaming platforms, just finding innovative ways to do it. But now that's an increasingly competitive market, and that's where people are looking for players. So crypto is really changing the rules of the game. And it's not just crypto either, it's kind of the wider ecosystem that we sit in. I've always made this point when we do kind of strategy stuff for bigger operators or smaller operators, that you are not really in control of your own destiny. You are slaves to the macro. You're slaves to payments, to Google, to Meta, to kind of technology trends, to wider media trends. And that's not a criticism of the business. That's just the businesses you are in. You're kind of an OTT business to a large extent. And you have to recognize that and move with that quickly. And the operators that do move quickest with those changes often do the best. And you see that, media platforms, affiliates, sports data, everyone is kind of trying to capture a deeper and more engaged relationship with their customer now. And it's much harder to kind of be an OTT player on some of those ecosystems who are kind of fighting for the same player and the same values. And then alongside that, as we say, these kind of two oppositional forces of kind of black and white is really the theme of the industry right now. And regulation is also a competitive filter because it's a barrier to entry for a lot of smaller firms who will then maybe choose to go into the black market, and then maybe be a competition in a different way. And this, the main factor of that, as it says there, is this accelerates consolidation. And so you see the bigger getting bigger. You see, Flutter and Entain are largely just a big warehouse of gambling brands at this point. There's not many huge synergies. Even with Flutter, which is, well, they're both really great organizations, but, Flutter, which is the one that everyone looks to as the kind of the leading regulated firm in the sector, they've got their Italian business, and it largely just sits separate to their US business, which sits separate to their UKI business, which sits separate to their Australia business. They have a platform underneath, which is kind of old and creaky, and that runs everything, but largely they're just independent businesses. But, and you're going to see a lot more of this. You're going to see the US firms stepping into this. You're going to see your DraftKings, possibly even your Fanatics, probably your MGMs, acquiring within Europe and LATAM, and the barriers to entry in regulated and the costs of being regulated will just create that additional kind of consolidatory momentum within the larger sector. And the other big force of change, which I think is something we'll come on to and speak about a little bit more as we get a bit deeper into this, is the way that your players, your users find you, the way that they consume media, the way that they consume the world around them is just changing dramatically quickly. And it's not just younger consumers as well. You see little events that kind of boost these trends. It's like the Gen X male, me. The Gen X male during lockdown who became a YouTube subscriber and now just watches YouTube and doesn't watch TV. These kind of things just happen, and they're just big quantum leaps, and all of a sudden the whole media environment has changed dramatically. These are happening all the time. AI is much talked about, but it is a big thing. Once you start using Perplexity or Claude or whoever for your search, you don't really go back to Google. And yes, it's a small percentage of people doing that now, but each iterative step of that will remove people from the Google ecosystem for kind of key search terms and key things. The kids are already not really using the media, the social media, the communication channels that we do. If you speak to anyone under 25, they're not on WhatsApp, or they're certainly not on Facebook. They're rarely even on Twitter unless they're particularly fascia-aligned. But it's, the landscape is changing, and it kind of comes back to the changing model. Act 3, this idea of just, throw a bunch of money at affiliates and paid search and you'll be absolutely fine. That's not really going to work. It might not even work now. It's certainly not going to work that well in the future. If you're not on, we've got them all listed here, but there's more as well. But, certainly if you're not on TikTok and Discord and Telegram, you're missing out on a bunch of people.
Alan, how do you think it will? I mean, we work with stake.com now, and for many years, and probably you guys know the story of Twitch, and then they ended up buying Kick and kind of having their own platform as an acquisition channel, right? What do you think is, do you think the other big players are going to follow with similar styles of like doing marketing? Do you think there's a specific channels they're underestimating, or they will just fall behind and the black market will basically eat more of their client base?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think, unfortunately, the answer is probably the latter. I think there's so much on the plate for the larger and even the smaller operators. There's so much regulatory compliance to deal with. There's so much shifting kind of player value considerations. There's a lot of them are listed. There's huge pressure to grow quarter on quarter on quarter. The idea of, suddenly radically changing your marketing approach, launching, a massive streaming network or influencer network or whatever it is just kind of so far out of their grasp. I think one interesting trend that could happen, and I think is likely to happen at some point, is that someone like, and Stake certainly want it to happen, don't they, is that someone like Stake gets so big, attracts some level of PE or VC investment, and they kind of become a bit like get the friends in the right places, like prediction markets, and then they just become too big to fail. And then all of a sudden, they are the new leaders. I mean, this is literally what bwin did, what PokerStars did, what a lot of other people have done in the past. There's not that much difference between PokerStars and Stake, really. It's just that PokerStars is now publicly listed and a part of Flutter, and Stake is not yet. But no, I think the big concern for kind of for regulated operators and regulatory adjacent operators, I think is probably a fair way to say it, is that they're just going to miss out on all of this. They are not prepared for it. They're not catering to it. They're not dealing with it. And yeah, I think it's a big challenge for them. Because like I say, it was kind of forced on Stake to do this, but boy, has it been successful. You just need to look at kind of, your younger people, anyone under 30's For You feed on any of the social media things, just to see how often you see the Stake logo. It's insane. Or Rainbet these days. It's crazy. And then you look at that's a really nice lead, and so appreciate it. You look at how operators are responding to these kind of new market conditions. And it's none of this. It's none of this experimentation, kind of growth hacking, broader picture, strategic changes. It's just trying to make sure we make as much money as we used to, trying to make sure that we kind of maximize player values from what we've got. There's a slide in the presentation I gave in Barcelona where it's just kind of, this was the old model, make as much money as you can from the VIP tier. What's the new model? Make as much money as you can from the second highest value tier. And that's largely just what the industry has done. It's not really changed what it does, it's just altered it in an attempt to kind of increase margin and kind of lower risk. They didn't want to do it. It's still not really a mass market thing, because we all know this, the mass market doesn't really make you much money. It's a 95/5 business, and no one has really adjusted beyond kind of tinkering at the edges. But it does mean, and I'm not just saying this because it's an Optimove conference, I genuinely believe this, that, retention is kind of the new acquisition, isn't it? When you have mature markets where, valuable new player growth is really hard to come by, and generally what you're doing is competing for share of wallet with someone who's already got 15 accounts. That retention piece becomes so important, and you definitely are seeing that at the bigger operators now. There's as much, if not more, focus on retention than there is on acquisition, and that really is kind of a big change for those of us who've been around this industry for a long time. But this is kind of something that I think, and this kind of want to touch on this briefly. This is something that I really think is a big risk. Is what operators are doing is they're just looking to focus so much harder on controlling that margin, controlling those player values, that they're increasingly developing products that possibly degrade the customer experience a little bit. As you keep lowering RTPs, the games change, as you keep reducing generosity. Cheltenham this week in the UK, for those of you who know UK racing, massive event. What did I get when I logged onto my Ladbrokes account? A £1 free bet £5 free bet on 365, where I probably lose thousands of pounds a year. It's just the whole kind of general customer experience. It just feels just less engaged, less fun. And then you compare that to the black market world, and it's just so different, because in the black market world, it's like it's 2005 all over again. You know, there's nothing really new going on there. You know, it's whale hunting, minimal friction, maximum risk. If we go out of business tomorrow, so what? You know, we'll just lay those bets. You know, I mean, let's be honest, every single sports betting operator in the world lays bets that they cannot pay every single week. But, you know, there would be some effort to pay those in the regulated world if they hit, you know, if you're $2 billion SGP liabilities each weekend in the NFL actually clicked, there would be an effort to pay it. There certainly wouldn't in the crypto world. But, you know, it's a really, you know, I can't emphasize enough how much that kind of split, that dichotomy is just really making things so hard for everybody, and so easy really for the black market world. Especially where that black market world can operate in that kind of hazy, still grayish world, you know, where they're not just obviously, you know, it's not like UK black market or France black market or something like that.
Do you think the regulated market realizes that already? And I mean, one of the things you said there is that CRM, obviously retention becomes more important, right? Acquisition costs. I remember we used to have a slide back then, I don't know, 10 years ago, that acquiring a new player is 5 times more expensive than retaining an existing one. I think now in the US it's like 25x by now, and probably in most markets it's still, you know, 10x and more. Do you feel like when obviously you follow the market, you gave examples, so probably the answer is no, but that the level of retention and CRM you're getting from regulated operators better compared to the black market, or the black market is actually winning there as well in retention?
I mean, they're winning there in terms of generosity. So,
yeah,
but
right.
You know, but also a lot of the loyalty schemes, a lot of the gamification, a lot of you know, a lot of that has just been ripped entirely from the kind of the gaming world, but also from kind of the social casino world. You know, it's a really interesting. You know, one of the first presentations they were talking about the kind of engagement loops that you get through gamification and badges, and the way that you can kind of encourage urgency. Well, you can't do that in the regulated market. That would literally get you a ban from the gambling commission if you try to create that sense of urgency. So a lot of the things that really, let's be honest, most of the things that work in retention also work to generate addiction. And there's a very fine line between those. And in regulated markets, you have to be super careful about that. And in black markets, it's just up to you as the founders, owners to care. And honestly, it's quite hard to care when the financial rewards are so high. And that's not, you know, trying to be moral about it. It's just a fact of life. If no one's making you, the old regulated industry didn't care. You know, there was a famous story someone told me about, you know, a compliance person coming into Paddy Power and saying, right, there's this guy, he was betting on Cheltenham, then he was up till 4 a.m. chasing his losses on casino, and he's lost 10K, and then he's asked for another 10K to be reloaded. What should we do? And someone put their hand up and went, factor him to 10 and invite him to Ascot. And it's kind of, you know, that was what the industry was then. It's kind of, and that's where the black market sits. I do think where the regulated industry is generally better is their platforms, their systems, their architecture, their data capture, their data, all of that is generally better because they've got more experience, they've got better systems, you know, they've got better partners. You know, a lot of these kind of black market platforms are good, but they're not great. And a lot of them were the ones that were rejected by the regulated market.
Yeah.
That's why they've gone into it. So, you know, and again, I'm not going to name names. I'm sure you can guess. Certainly not pragmatic. But the, you know, there is, yeah, I think there's a huge advantages that regulated industry has in terms of retention and its ability to deeply understand its customers, but it needs to do more to engage them. It needs to do more around that kind of gamification layer, around that engagement layer. It just needs to do so much more to do that. And I think this is kind of part of it as well. You team me up so well here, Moshe. I appreciate it. This is something that's a real bugbear of mine. There's a massive generational misunderstanding against boomer adjacents like me, which is millennials are not young. I'm sorry to any millennials in the room. You are not young. You are middle-aged. It's, you know, millennials are, you know, largely in their like late 30s and 40s now, aren't they? It's kind of, you know, it's like those are not young people. Gen Z is not even that young. You know, I think the oldest Gen Z turns 30 this year or next year. You know, these are largely people in their 20s. These are largely people with jobs, with income. These are largely people who have, you know, money to spend and lose on online gambling. And crucially, all of these groups have had very, very different experiences growing up, very different expectations from media, from games, from products. You know, they look for things in different places. I did a big project for a large operator, and one of my conclusions on that was like, in this sector, you are invisible to a lot of players. Mm-hmm. They just don't see you. You are their dad's gambling brand, and that's for quite a large chunk of people. You know, you really need to understand that the market has already changed. It's not changing, it's changed. And you are competing with a bunch of different things for attention. And where you would previously look for your customers, they're not there anymore. They're not watching TV. They're not searching on Google. They're certainly not on Facebook. You know, so a lot of where you're looking for these people, they're not there anymore. And the other kind of big issues that you find is that alongside this, you have constantly shifting regulatory and political changes. You know, the whole prediction markets thing in the US is because they've got friends in high places. Like, there's no sensible reading of CTFC regulations that says the prediction market should be allowed. It's ridiculous for sports betting. But they are. That's the world we live in. It's not changing. Get on with it. And this is kind of what's happened. They're probably going to be too big to fail at some point. Maybe there's some regulatory pressure. Who knows with prediction markets? It's very, very hard. But, you know, their valuations are probably valid at the minute. They are game-changing products. Yeah, they're just a betting exchange, but it kind of doesn't matter. Uber's just a mini-cab firm. It doesn't matter. You know, it doesn't matter at some point. They have fundamentally different things to the consumer, and that's all that matters. We do this with a lot of our product testing. You know, you may think your app's fast. Your app may be fast. If the consumer doesn't think it's fast, it it doesn't matter. Knew I'd fail. It's so, and I think, but you know, these things are going to keep happening. The US is probably going to have some RG, safer gambling type pushback at some point, because some of the losses there are just unbelievable, and some of the player values are just unbelievable. So you're going to see continued political volatility, and gambling is a stick that people like to beat people with, because you know, and it's not just a right or left issue either. You know, you see, I think it was Italy, they had a right-wing government that pushed back massively against gambling. Spain had a left-wing government that pushed back massively against gambling. It's quite a populist issue, and this is going to keep happening.
We had a small workshop on prediction markets, thanks to Jacob, who sits here, who works for Predicted, one of our clients. And I started to hear the buzz around prediction markets in G2E last year. Obviously, sweeps with all the regulation and everything that is happening in California, New York, other states. Companies are looking to shift, and one of the optional routes, at least back then, people talk about prediction markets. I realized last week in New York, when I sat with Jacob for 2 hours, that it's much more complicated than I thought. And I left that meeting saying, okay, it's not going to be sweeps where suddenly we see 300 new operators. So do you think the same? Do you think that it will? I mean, there's the giants, right? The Polymarket and Kalshi, and there will be probably a few others. But do you see like platforms that are actually going into prediction markets and offering it as a platform to smaller operators, like we've seen in sweepstakes? Or
I mean, the problem you have with prediction markets is it is fundamentally a betting exchange. Mm-hmm. So liquidity matters enormously, and you can fake liquidity. So it won't be the case there can only be like one or two big spots. You know, you can either duplicate it. You know, you don't, as someone once said, you don't have to be an elephant. You just have to pretend to be an elephant. But you know, you can kind of duplicate the liquidity. You can kind of just do your own market making. You can be a de facto sports. But there's lots of ways you can get around it. But fundamentally, it's a liquidity issue that will, like online poker, lead to a point where there are 2 or 3 major winners and a bunch of smaller. Like there won't be a tier 2. There'll be a tier 1 and a tier 3. But it's certainly feasible for kind of tier 3 operators to still exist in that world. Who will be those winners? That's a much more interesting thing. You know, Chris Grover, our company, who knows a lot more about prediction markets than me, very well connected in that world. You know, he is talking about how the gamification layer on top of prediction markets is going to be a new big thing. You know, where you basically use the prediction market almost as a kind of enabler for other products you do on sports sites, on commerce sites.
Interesting.
Fashion, you know, there's lots of things you can do on news sites, weather sites, whatever. And I think that will be a big thing. And I think who ends up being that kind of core platform provider for that, it will almost certainly be Kalshi or Polymarket, you think?
Yeah.
Probably Polymarket, but who knows, really? And, you know, so that is going to be a really interesting thing because no one's really talking about the ecology piece. I get lost in the weeds here, but the ecology piece of prediction markets is fascinating because ultimately there's only one source of money. These are zero-sum resolution outcome events. There's only one source of money in, and that's losing players. So and I think we'll come to it in a second, the big thing you have to have in gambling always has been, always will be happy losers. You need to make happy losers. And who are the happy losers in prediction markets? Are institutional funds really going to be happy doing in billions of dollars every year? I don't think so. Are customers who are getting you're not getting bonused because of the economics of it make it really difficult? You know, they're used to getting like a 10K bonus from BetMGM. Are they going to really just lose all their money on Kalshi instead and get nothing? Get like a $50 Amazon gift voucher or whatever? There's some fundamental ecology problems to solve, and that will kind of, again, kind of lead to, I think, the big boys surviving. Interesting, you know, Matchbook are trying to launch out there. I think I saw Malcolm in the room. Hello, Malcolm. They've got an interesting conceit, you know, that they understand this ecology piece better than others. They understand, you know, various aspects of it, and that might give them a heads up. But yeah, it is going to become a it's going to become a liquidity piece like a lot of things are. And it kind of ties back to this kind of last point here on this slide. You know, technology is changing fast, but that will enable some of the smaller operators to kind of compete in those. It'll enable smaller operators to be much more agile. It's way reducing the cost of developing new features, developing new platforms, integrating features. You know, the barriers that have previously existed around platform and games and content and even payments and I was reading some tweet yesterday that the head of growth, there was one person in the growth marketing team at Anthropic for like 10 months, and they did everything all by themselves, just using a bunch of Claude tools. This stuff is real. This stuff is happening now, and this stuff will develop more. This entire presentation is a AI-recorded phone conversation between myself and Motti, which was then fed into ChatGPT for a summary and then fed into Claude to produce the presentation. And yeah, I edited it a little bit, but that's how this has been done. Not to make a point, but I guess it kind of makes a point too. The whole thing took about 10 minutes. The conversation took longer than putting the presentation together. So, and that's really a big challenge to everyone. So to wrap up with a few big takeaways. So this is an interesting one. Everything at the minute in the industry is this kind of weird duality where it's two things at once. Acquisition is both much more expensive and much cheaper, depending on who you are and where you go. But you know, largely in big regulated market, acquisition is just, if it's not more expensive, it's certainly harder. And winning intention is increasingly difficult. I think the main message there really, though, is that the easy growth era, unless you're in, and even if you're in black markets these days, because the easy growth era in black markets is also gone because there's so many brands launching. So unless you go really, really super black, then it's quite hard. So acquisition is harder and sometimes more expensive. That is a fact. And then as a result, you know, once you win a customer, you must defend them. You have, retention is, I'm genuinely not just saying this, They're not even paying me. It is the key battleground here. It really is, and it will be for the next 4 years at least, I think. And again, coming back to that point, this is the key question you should be always asking yourself. How do we keep happy losers, or how do we make losers happy? Someone mentioned this to me back in like 2003, and it stuck with me ever since, and it's so true, and it's the guiding principle behind any successful gambling business. And that really does mean that customer experience, which I touched on earlier, great games, great customer experience, great customer service, everything working together. Some of the big success stories of the industry have been really where marketing and product and trading have all really synced together and created this kind of, the brand stood for something in the customer's mind. It represented something. They knew what it was, and they knew what it did, and they knew how it worked. And everything about it, from its brand messaging to its retention messaging to the way the product looked to the type of content it had, kind of fitted together. I think Stake does that really, really well. And I think that's a much overlooked aspect of Stake. I don't think many of the other black market sites do, to be honest, but I think Stake does. And PokerStars did it really well. Skybet did it really well. DraftKings did it really well, actually. But that's really the picture. And the kind of the final point I kind of want to leave you with is touching back on that kind of generational shift, touching back on a lot of the things we talked about today. Are you ready for the customer of tomorrow? Because they're kind of the customer of today. There are big VIPs in that under 30 segment already, aren't there? You will know this better than I. And as I say, millennials are middle-aged. Gen Z have got plenty of money and plenty of crypto. They're looking in different places. You're probably, if you're an old operator, you're probably invisible to a lot of them. But it's not a problem. It's a challenge, and it's an opportunity, a crisis-opportunity, as Homer Simpson would say. It's, there's optionality there. There's ways to attack this. There's things you can do. And I think really taking time to zoom out, understand the big picture, understand where you sit in it, understand what your opportunities are and where you can find customers, where you can retain them, and how you can maximize monetization for them is really the big challenge of the next few years. And the operators that prepare for tomorrow are the ones that are going to win.
Thank you. One closing question, Alan. If we were sitting here again 3 years from today, we're actually standing. What will surprise us most about this industry and how the industry will evolve in the next 3 years?
I genuinely think the big power players of today will not be the big power players of tomorrow. I think that's the biggest surprise that you will see. I think you're starting to see that in some share prices already. I don't think that's a short-term thing. I think that's a structural shift. I think you're seeing the prediction markets of the world, the stakes of the world, but it's not just them either. Again, it's a slide we did in Barcelona as well. If you look at the makeup of the big regulated gambling firms, the center of gravity has massively shifted from like the UK and Northern Europe to Southern Europe. You've got, Allwyn, you've got Banjay, you've got, big power players now based in Greece, based in France, based in Eastern Europe. I think you're going to see the nature of what the power players are and the people who control the industry and dictate the trends and dictate. I think we'll come back in 3 years, and some of the big guys now will be yesterday's companies and yesterday's brands, unless they fundamentally change what they're doing and kind of prepare. But the problem is, when you're sitting on a 20-year-old platform where it takes you 6 months to roll out a new feature, that's quite hard to do. And I think that's the thing that's really, Bet365 is going to sell to someone at some point. That's going to change the things as well. But yeah, I think the big change we're going to see is the nature of the power players within this industry is already changing, is going to change, I think, quite fundamentally in the next 3 to 5 years.
Thank you very much. I think we are a few minutes over, so it was super insightful, and I guess you'll be around if anyone wants to ask a question. Thank you. Thank you very much.